Oh, Representative Pickard.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that we accept the minutes as written for both dates.
Is there a second? Seconded by Representative. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. We're going to start today with a presentation from Toby Doherty of the Hayes, City of Hayes. I'm sorry. You're the manager there. Thank you, Toby.
Thank you, Mr. I did pass the presentation along. I believe they are pulling it up.
While he's bringing that up, I'll let the committee know we're missing several members this morning that are over in the Senate committee. They're working the 2279 and 2302 bills this morning. They're over there to lend a little technical assistance, and hopefully they'll be back here by the time we finish to give us a report on how things went over in the Senate committee.
I could do that. You'll advance the slides? Okay, you can go to the next slide. In 1983, the city of Hayes consumed 3,600 acre-feet of water, and last year we consumed 2,100 acre-feet of water. This reduction in water use coincided with a 30% increase in population and a 40% increase in commercial accounts. So Hayes is the water conservation leader in the state of Kansas, municipal water conservation leader in the state of Kansas, and we have been for 30 years. There's a reason behind this, though, and some of you may wonder, why is it we always hear about Hayes when we hear about water conservation? If you go to the next slide. This is a rainfall map of Kansas. You guys have all seen this. Far western part of the state gets about 15 inches of water a year. Far eastern part of the state gets about 48 inches of rain. The yellow line represents 30 inches of annual rainfall. With 30 inches of annual rainfall, you have predictable, reliable, year-round stream flow, so surface water is a viable option. If you go to the next slide. This slide's a little busy, so bear with me, please. The shaded areas represent the 35 most populated counties in Kansas. The yellow line is obviously 30 inches of annual rainfall, and then we have the High Plains Aquifer superimposed on there. So out of the 35 most populated counties in Kansas, 34 of them are either along or east of that 30-inch rainfall line or set on top of a major aquifer. There's one population center that does it, and that's Ellis County. So that's the reason why Hayes has had to invest in conservation measures, and we've had to do this for 30 years. Next slide. In 1991, the city of Hayes experienced a moderate drought by drought standards. This is actually the Smoky Hill River last fall, just south of Hayes. We have a well field on the Smoky Hill River. It looked like this back in the 91 drought. What that drought did was it exploited unsustainable behavior by the city, but also exploited the fragileness of our resources. And so, like any city in a similar situation, the first instinct was to find more water. We're on the high plains, and there's not a lot of readily available, accessible water on the high plains. So Plan B was to conserve what they had. And so the governing body and the city leaders at the time made a concerted effort to invest in water conservation. Next slide, please. So they started with the low-hanging fruit: shower heads, toilets, washing machines. And back in the 90s, the federal government didn't mandate any efficiencies with these devices. So the city started giving the residents shower heads, free shower heads. To date, we've given away over 20,000 free shower heads, and right now, if you walk into City Hall with an old shower head, we'll give you a new low-flow shower head for free. It's been a pretty successful program. We have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars incentivizing the replacement of old inefficient toilets with more water-efficient toilets, and we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to incentivize people getting rid of inefficient washing machines and replacing them with low-usage washing machines. Next slide, please. The city also dealt with the issue through rates and regulations. So back in the 90s, the city had a water rate structure like a lot of cities actually still do, in that the more water you use, the less you pay per gallon. They put in a reverse rate structure. So the more water you use, the more you pay per gallon, trying to incentivize water conservation and good water behavior. It took us out a lot of the industrial water uses, so that's why you don't really see any water-laden industries in Hayes. The city also adopted a couple regulations that are still in practice today. One is an outdoor watering ban. So between June 30th and September 1st, between the hours of noon and 7 p.m., you can't water your lawn in Hayes. When it's 105 on the high plains and the humidity is about 12% and the wind's blowing, not much of that water is making it to the root system if you're watering at 3 in the afternoon, and it's not healthy for the plants either. So you can actually be ticketed for that if you violate that. Another regulation put in place at the time was to address things like this. You've all driven around and see somebody's irrigation system going, and either it's not set right and it's doing a great job of watering the street, or the ground is saturated and it's just running off. Well, that's most of the time potable drinking water that's just running down the street. So you can actually be ticketed for that in Hayes too. Now, ticketing is not our first instinct. We try to educate, then we warn, and only when behavior doesn't change do we actually write a ticket. Next slide, please. The third thing they did was they invested heavily in reuse water and education. So the visual on the left is a reservoir on the back nine of our municipal golf course. The city built an effluent water line that stretches around the south and southwest part of town. We irrigate ball fields, soccer fields, a golf course, a sports complex. Fort Hays State University uses a little bit of it for some of their outdoor watering. But depending on the year, we use up to 35% of our produced effluent for irrigation purposes. This allows us to have amenities that our residents demand, but not have to develop additional sources or treat drinking water to drinking water standards and then put it back on the ground. And then lastly, they invested in education. So the mayor, the city commissioners, the city staff at the time, they started going into every third grade class every year and talking about water conservation. And they taught them about the value of water conservation while they were learning about the hydrological cycle. So those kids then took that knowledge home and they conditioned their parents into being better stewards of the water. And then those kids grew into adults. And now we have a lot of kids that have just learned the value of water conservation through the school system and in Hayes. Next slide, please. So the results are clear. We are the municipal water conservation leader in the state of Kansas. So this is our gallons per capita per day usage sheet. We were at 84 gallons per capita per day last year. The way gallon per capita per day typically works in the state, when you look at municipal water suppliers, the further east you get, the lower it gets because they have more natural rainfall. So you don't need as much supplemental irrigation if you're irrigating cool season turf. And then the more urban area you're in, the more dense urban area you're in, you'll use less water just because of the way people utilize water. So suburban areas typically use more than a dense urban setting. Region 4 is the vertical regions that the state breaks down water suppliers into. So the Region 4 average is the north-south region that Hayes is part of. That region uses about 156 gallons per day, and we use 84. Conservation's a way of life in Hayes. It's not a phase. We don't just do this when it gets dry and then we forget about it when it gets wet. We do this 365 days a year through wet years and dry years. We do not let our foot off the gas ever. We are prepared to ratchet up during times of drought. We have additional water conservation measures as part of our drought response plan, but we do not let up on our water conservation efforts. So I came to Hayes in 2005 and quickly learned the value of our programs and what we have done. And I was the person that entities would come ask to talk about water conservation, and I grew to be very proud of what we did. In 2010, I went to a conference hosted by the Southern Nevada Water Authority where they brought together practitioners and water suppliers from California, the Desert Southwest, the Mountain West. And I realized we were still riding the high from the early 90s and we hadn't adjusted our tactics. So we were behind the curve, quite frankly. So a couple commissioners were at that conference. We came back, had a public discussion, and decided we're going to take it to the next level. So next slide, please. So we were the first city in Kansas to hire a water conservation specialist. This is a person that does nothing but eat, sleep, and drink water conservation and manage our programs, and manage our social media, and manage our outreach and education. We were one of the first cities in Kansas to adopt the Green Plumbing Code. I'm not sure if we were the first, but I think we were one of the first. We were the first city in Kansas to adopt comprehensive landscaping regulations dealing with outdoor water usage, the amount of irrigated area, and the amount of turf overall you can have. We took those regulations from the Salt Lake City area. And we were the first turf rebate program in the Midwest. We took this from the city of Las Vegas. We will pay people to rip out their irrigated cool season turf and replace it with warm season grasses, xeriscaping, or something accessible that uses, something similar that uses less water. Next slide, please. Now that we had a water conservation specialist in place, we could take our education and outreach efforts to the next level. So the person in the visual here is Holly Dickman, our water conservation specialist currently. She is talking to a couple different classes here. She goes into all of the schools every year and helps the teachers with the curriculum in order to make sure that she's getting the most bang for the buck for the education outreach. Next slide, please. But something unique that Holly did is she formed a partnership with the representative from the Kansas State University Watershed Protection District. So Kansas State University is charged with protecting watersheds from water quality issues across the state. So in this visual, the top left, the person next to Holly is Stacy Minson. She's the watershed protection specialist for K-State. They combine their efforts to not only educate the kids and the public about water quantity, but water quality, because the two are tied together. You know, once you get water dirty, somebody has to treat it. So just because you're sending it downstream, you're sending a problem downstream. And so they're teaching kids about the value of water overall, and that there's only so much water to go around, and we have to be good stewards of it. So next slide, please. They do things like demonstration gardens. They sponsor Fort Hays State basketball games. They sponsor booths at various events around the town, at Art Walk. They do a poster contest every year where we have hundreds of entries where it'll be a topic, and then kids will design posters and they'll be judged and they'll get awards, and the classes will get prizes for it. Recently, this Tuesday, they hosted a World Water Fun Fest as part of World Water Day, which is coming up later this month. That was at Sternberg Museum. Next slide, please. And there was over 300 people attended that event, and we not only had representatives from watershed protection and our city, but city stormwater, our water reclamation and reuse superintendent was there teaching the kids about how wastewater gets treated. I mean, it was a great event, and the kids learned a lot. So next slide, please. This is the social media, just some samples of our social media. Having a water conservation specialist in place means we can be very aggressive in our marketing, radio, TV, things like that. And she does a wonderful job of marketing our programs to all audiences. Next slide, please. So you have to be prepared to adapt and evolve. We're always trying new things, and we're stopping things that don't work. We had a great idea a few years ago. There's a lot of urinals around. So there's some urinals that aren't very efficient. And so we thought, hey, let's incentivize property owners to replace urinals. Wasn't so easy. We even tried bounties for plumbers to try to bring us project. Wasn't that easy. We finally dropped the program. Urinals are a lot harder to replace than a toilet. In some cases, you got to tear half the wall out to replace the urinal. And even though we tried some pretty hefty incentives, it didn't work. But new for this year is rebates for smart irrigation controllers and rain sensor shutoffs. So these are devices that if your irrigation's set to run and it rains, it'll automatically shut it off. Or if you set your irrigation to run, say, twice a week or 3 times a week, it will sense the soil moisture and automatically adjust how much the zones run in order to make sure that you're putting down a consistent amount of water. So we're hoping that program takes off a little bit. The most common question I get when I talk to other communities is, how do you pay for a program like this? And so the shorter answer is you have to prioritize it. If you want to have a water conservation program, you have to figure out what you want to do, how much it's going to cost, prioritize it and make it part of your budget. Just like personnel, just like capital outlay, just like treatment costs, you have to make it a regular part of your budget. If it's an afterthought, it's always going to be an afterthought. If it's an add-on, it's always going to be an add-on. If it's something you just do during dry years, the second it starts raining, you're going to quit doing it. You have to build it into your program. Next slide, please. Another way you can do that is determine the cost to either develop a new water source or treat additional water supply. So there are cities that deal with treatment requirements, and so, or treatment restrictions. So if you have a 5 million gallon a day treatment facility and you could see yourself growing to 7 or 8 in 20 years, well, you need to build a new treatment facility or add on, and that costs money. Or you can figure out how much it costs and cut and defray that cost down the road as you conserve. In the city of Hayes' case, our treatment's not an issue, but source is. And we know that it's going to cost us a minimum of $20,000 to develop a new acre foot of water. That's just develop. That's not treat, O&M. That's just a development cost. So if I spend $10 on a shower head and give 55 of them away to save 1 acre foot of water, I just spent $550 to save not spending 20. And so we do the math on everything that we incent to try to quantify the rebate and make sure we're being efficient with it. Next slide, please. You know, I've mentioned how proud we are of our water conservation efforts, but we think in Hayes that we have reached the effective limits of conservation. You've heard of the law of diminishing returns. We can keep squeezing a little bit more out of our residents, but it's going to start looking like this in Hayes. We're already the only city in Kansas that are adopting our best practices from places like Tucson and Las Vegas and Phoenix and California. We're proud of our efforts. We think we manage our sources well. The rest of Kansas thinks we're those poor people that don't have any water. And they think that because we do this, because we're the only city doing this. We think it's created a stigma. We think it is, we know that it's hurt us from business recruitment in the past. And I'm not talking ethanol facilities or something that uses a lot of water. I'm talking just businesses that may not want to locate to Hayes because they're unsure of what our water situation is going to be. When we get things that come across my desk from the Economic Development Group, we always look at how many homes does that equate to for water usage. And there are times where we have to tell them, we can't take that, don't put in an application to try to get that business here when other cities wouldn't even look at the water usage of that city. But we have to look at it that way, and it's hamstrung our ability to grow, and we are growing actually in Hayes. There was a recent newspaper article that referred to us as the California of Kansas. And that said that because we're really the only city in Kansas that are acting like a city in California. So additional supply is critical for us. We have reached the maximum utilization of our sources. We're using them as efficiently as we can get. They are very susceptible to drought because they're shallow alluvial sources, and so they depend on rainfall to renew. So if you go to the next slide, please. In 1995, the city of Hayes purchased a 7,000-acre property in Edwards County, and the property had 8,000 acre-feet of water rights associated with it. And a year later, the city of Russell, who's our co-leader in conservation, and I need to call Russell out because Russell was a little later to the game than us, but they're just 20 miles up the road and they have the same issues we do. They are quickly catching up to us as the leader in conservation. Russell does a wonderful job with conserving water, and especially with their industrial customers. They're doing a good job of conserving their water. So Russell came along a year later and bought an 18% interest in the property. The two cities then spent 20 years looking at every other option available to them. In 2014, the governing bodies signed a joint interlocal agreement and directed me to start the process, the regulatory process to develop the property as a municipal water supply. And we have been navigating through that process since 2015. Next slide, please. We took our conservation approach to the development of the property in Edwards County. Beginning in 2007 with the EQIP program, we started shutting wells off. By 2017, all the infrastructure had been removed and the property had been planted back to native grass. This is actually a picture of the property. We are trying to get it back to a native shortgrass sandhill prairie environment. We're working very hard on that. We have entered into discussions with Wildlife and Parks about creating a public use area on the property. For the governing bodies of Hayes and Russell, first and foremost, water supply. Second priority is public benefit. So we're trying to figure out the best public benefit we can for this property. But most importantly is we agreed to reduce our legally available water on the property by 30% below what regulations allow us to when we convert it from irrigation to municipal usage. We did it because we wanted to be good stewards of the water and good stewards of the environment and good neighbors down there. I think as you guys are quickly learning on the water committee the last couple of years, we have more water rights in Kansas than we have water. In fact, we have 4,000 acre-foot of water rights in Hayes, and if I could pump that, I wouldn't be here talking to you because we would have plenty of water, but we can't pump that. And so we recognize that in this area, that there are more water rights than water, and so we legally agreed to reduce our water rights to a sustainable number because we wanted to be good stewards of the environment. I know I threw a lot at you, but I would stand for any questions if you have them.
Representative Stogsdale.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Up until this point, the most impressive presentation I've seen was on public television on water conservation in Las Vegas, that they'd grown 750,000 people over the last 10 years, and yet they'd cut their water consumption by 29%. I think you just shot past them. So my concern was, I can't imagine why every city in western Kansas is not coming to you guys for assistance and ideas as far as conserving water out in that area. Is there any way that we can facilitate that or help with that?
So as to the why, I think it's a path of least resistance, you know, and if you think back to the visual I showed with the 34 most populated counties, you know, we're the only city that's had to deal with this in a real manner. You get further west on the High Plains Aquifer and you have water. And from an economic standpoint, if you're a farmer, that water may not provide enough value for you to use as an irrigation well, but as a city, it's plenty of water for me. So it's tough to make that distinction. I will point out a couple of communities. Garden City's invested heavily in water conservation at the industrial and the residential level. Dodge City is now starting to do some big projects regarding water conservation. We have a Zoom meeting next week with the city of Dighton that is looking to get heavily involved in water conservation. I know Scott City has reached out to the City of Hayes water conservation specialist about what can we do to start a conservation program. So I think there's a growing interest in the western part of the state for this, and we're happy to help anybody. I'm not sure what you guys can do to incent. I haven't given that much thought.
Well, thank you for your presentation, and especially for what you're doing out there in the western part of the state. It's very impressive.
Thank you.
Representative Blex.
Thank you for being here and driving a long ways, hopefully through some rain. But I remember the first time I went into a motel in Hayes, and first time in the 80s, and I turned the shower head on, and man, there wasn't much water coming out of it. And I found out quickly what you'd done, and congratulations. I guess I have a couple of questions. And Hayes is what, about 21,000 people? How do you see this being able to function and work, at least on a partial basis? I mean, you're giving a lot of rebates, you're spending a lot of money to change things. A town of 2,000 or 3,000 people, do you see this being able to work? And then the second question is and we're working on some cost and we just hopefully will get $45 million to the state of Kansas for water issues under our new bill. And matter of fact, I'm going to Caney, Kansas, won't be here tomorrow, Monday, to talk to the city commission about water issues, which they've had a terrible issue. And some of the issues we deal with, and I've tried, you know, buffalo grass and stuff, it just won't work in eastern Kansas for lawns. You know, Bermuda grass will, somewhat low maintenance. But our problem down there is to convince it, because we have that 42 inches of rain, and people tend to forget it once we get past the drought, and we're in extreme drought for that country right now. But the cost of, and I'd like to know the cost, because we're looking at cost of giving $45 million, and I don't think the chairman of this committee really consider things like the cost of that land, of what it's going to cost you guys, and what's spent on water, even though the state of Kansas didn't do it, but the city done it. And so it's a two-part question there, but will your system work for small communities, say 1,000 to 2,000, and what was the cost of that Kinsey Ranch purchase?
I'll address the last one first, Representative. The cost of the ranch was, I believe, $3.6 million in 1995. We think we got a good deal. The cost of the actual program for us is about $350,000 for 2023 is what we spend on the water conservation program. As far as that working in a small community, I think if you have buy-in from the community and buy-in from the governing body of the community, and especially if you can quantify what you're buying. So either I'm going to have to invest in additional supply treatment, additional supply, or a drought vulnerability. So we have a couple communities in adjacent to us, City of Ellis, City of Victoria. They have, most of the time, they have very reliable water supplies. During times of extreme drought, they don't. They're investing in water conservation measures. The process we're doing to undertake the property in Everest County is going to create a regional supply, a little bit of a drought backup for them. But I think you have to figure out what your drought vulnerability is and what's that worth to you. Is being able to stave off your drought vulnerability by 50% worth $50,000 investment? If that's the case, then that's how you quantify that investment. It's just, you have to make it a priority if you want it to work.
And I follow up, Ken. And I appreciate that because we talk a lot about a lot of things, you know, new treatment plants, new supplies, new sources, but sometimes we do easily forget the low-hanging fruit of conservation. Mm-hmm. That's the first thing that can go, and I appreciate, and I know educating the kids is probably the key there to get that, because when little Johnny comes home and says to Dad or Mom that, you know, this toilet isn't very efficient or whatever that they learn, it has an impact. So I appreciate, you know, what you've done, and it looks like it's paying some dividends, and thank you for coming and giving it.
One of our most successful programs in the schools is we give the kids the dye tabs to put in your toilet tank to see if it's leaking, and they can't wait to run home and try it, and then there's a form they can fill out and take back to their teacher if their toilet's leaking, and then we give them information on toilet rebates. So, you know, it works pretty well.
Representative Sywert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to congratulate you, too, for your efforts. I remember very distinctly when you was trying to get all that land acquisition to do that. I'm from Pretty Prairie, and if you know Pretty Prairie, we're the first point source of pollution from overuse of irrigation and fertilizer. I wish you could train the Department of Water Resources or the GMDs on how to quit issuing permits in these positions, because in a lot of these areas, they were supposed to be managing the water in our state. And my dad always said, one day water will be worth more than oil. If we do not have water for the citizens of the state of Kansas, we will not have a state. And you look at what you did, is amazing what you did and drop that consumption. And yet we still won't get rid of the use it or lose it laws, and we keep issuing permits in our areas when we're short of water. I don't understand how you took such a great positive approach to giving the people in Hayes water and accessibility to it, but yet the people that have managed that water system have put us in that position. And I want to thank you for your efforts to do what you do. And especially like the people in Pretty Prairie, you have to live it in order to understand it. And if you don't have water and you drill 40 new wells for residential people, they start to see how important that water is, especially when they see it running down the road for a mile because they don't shut it off. I appreciate what you do.
Thank you.
Representative Amix.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Doherty, always good to see you. It's been a while. A month ago, the chairman gave us the opportunity to do a little bit of homework, and it was for our own communities and what we were using for water. We did a similar deal where we reported back to the committee about the amount of water that our communities were using, and most of us had broken it down in their per capita daily use. And your number's very, very close to what we are. You're missing Lawrence on there, and we're not close to 84 gallons a day. So I really appreciate the fact that what you've done is given us this and made us realize what we can do as communities throughout the state, whether we're on the eastern part of that line, the rain line that you had had on your presentation, and this is impressive. I mean, it really is. In a time where your community is so much different than the community that I live in, where you're forced to do things like this, and you've met that challenge, I congratulate all of you. I really do. It shows what my community on the eastern part of the state could do. And so, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Pickard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was really a good presentation. And you gave the same one in McPherson at the municipalities meeting, right? And so I think you kind of explained how the water was moved from Edwards County up to Hayes and probably to Russell too, because, yeah. Did you build a pipeline? I mean, how did that work?
We're not there yet, Representative.
Okay, okay.
I wish.
Okay.
We're still finishing up the final part of the regulatory process. There's so when a water right owner wants to transfer more than 2,000 acre feet, more than 35 miles in Kansas, there's an additional process that has to take place, and it's the Water Transfer Act. There's a statewide means test that has to take place. And so we are in the middle of that process right now. There's a hearing panel, there's a hearing officer that's been appointed, an administrative law judge. There's a hearing that's set for the end of July, first part of August in Wichita to handle this. To be a public comment period. And so after that process, assuming we meet the criteria outlined in the statute, then we can get approval to transfer the water. We're going to start design of the project shortly. So when we get approval of the regulatory process, we can start getting the project out for bid. The plan is to build a 67-mile pipeline from the property. The city of Hayes has a well field at Shin Shin on the Smoky Hill River. It's about 10 miles south of town. And we will drop the water to our existing infrastructure there. And then Russell has a well field at Pfeiffer, which is maybe 5 miles from the eastern part of our well field, also on the Smoky Hill River. So Russell will build an interconnect and then use their existing infrastructure to get it to Russell. And then with that, we can help the communities in Ellis County and the water districts in Ellis County during times of drought. We can provide a drought backup for them.
Thank you.
Representative Getz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Sandy, for your question. It was kind of related to my question of kind of what's happening with the Kinsey Ranch and all of that. I guess in a follow-up, what has been some of the, you talked about having to jump through some hoops here in the Water Transfer Act, I think you said. Is that process, in your opinion, going through the process, is it a good process? Are those right regulations to have? Have you ran into it so hard that it's like, we really feel like we should change some of this and make it a little easier for people when they do need to do this? Anyway, just kind of a follow-up. Thanks for the update on that and just kind of what you had to go through.
So our attorneys will bludgeon me if I don't answer your question correctly. Our attorney, the strict literal reading of the Water Transfer Act, he believes that it doesn't apply to existing water rights. So allegedly I wasn't here in Kansas, but allegedly the Water Transfer Act was put into place when Wichita was looking at unallocated water rights in Milford Lake, thinking about developing those water rights and transferring to Wichita. Milford Lake is obviously a water supply stabilizer for a lot of downstream uses on the Kansas River. So the state legislature put the Water Transfer Act in place to say, hey, let's make sure there's a statewide benefits test before we just allow something like this to happen. So our attorney doesn't think that the Transfer Act applies to existing water rights that are already perfected and developed and were sort of purchased on the open market. So if there is one thing that could be changed, I think maybe clarifying that would be a good opportunity. As far as the transfer process itself, it's been great so far. It's very straightforward. There's 26 criteria in the statutes that we have to meet to demonstrate the statewide means test. We think we're going to easily demonstrate those. The process is working very smoothly, and it hasn't been undertaken in its current iteration. So we think it's working very smoothly. The change application process to convert the water from irrigation municipal, that was nightmarish, but it's a process, and we just have to deal with it, and we made it through it. But that would be the only suggestion I would have for the Water Transfer Act, is to clarify whether it's for new water rights or existing water rights.
Any further questions? Representative White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Toby. That was an outstanding presentation. First, I'd like to comment on my colleague from Prairie Village, I think we ought to somehow incentivize this gallons per capita. If we could recognize in front of on the floor or something, who wins in the state of Kansas. I think it would be kind of neat. But, okay, my question for you is, the Kinsley Ranch is in my district. And you mentioned that you enrolled those acres in equipped. Why not CRP?
That I couldn't tell you, Representative. We actually have utilized a company called Farmers National to manage the property for us, and they contract with the tenant, who is a local in the area, to actually farm the property. When we purchased the property, there were 40-some irrigated circles, maybe 39, but we had 40 capability. And Representative Seaver mentioned the use it or lose it. So EQIP was the first opportunity for us to retire water rights, or at least shut them off. That was a 10-year period. They pay you for a certain amount. We took advantage of EQIP in, I think, 2008, 2009, 2007, 8, 9 maybe. And why not CRP? I don't know. And that might have been an issue because maybe as a governmental owner, we couldn't take advantage of it, but the tenant could take advantage of the EQIP and then pass those monies back on to us. That's kind of what's going in my memory. When Governor Brownback asked for the 50-year water vision to be created, one of the things that was adopted after that vision was adopted was there was legislation that was passed that got rid of use it or lose it, only for areas that are close to new appropriations, though. And so the area we're in is close to new appropriation. So when that happened, we started shutting the rest of the property off. And that's when we full scale took the infrastructure out, planted it back to native grass.
If I may, one more. Retiring water rights, 30%, is that what you said? Or is it a different way to get to 30%?
So here's how the 30% works. If you are, I'll use a feedlot as an example. If I want to locate a feedlot in an area, I go out and I buy an existing irrigation water right, and I convert that via the consumptive use process to stock watering. And that process is formulaic. It's usually done by county. So you don't get gallon per gallon, but if you have 100 gallons of irrigation rights, you might get 80 gallons of stock watering rights. It's only supposed to be what the plant consumes or evapotranspirates. So our process yielded a number of 6,756 acre-feet of water. That was our consumptive use number. So if we weren't going through the Water Transfer Act, or if we were a dairy or a feedlot or an industry, that wanted to do this, we would just take that 6,756 and walk away. The issue is the 6,756 is not sustainable. So the chief engineer at the time asked us if we would commit to sustainable usage. And we pushed back and we argued, and we finally agreed to, because we have no intention of using it unsustainably. So what we agreed to was, it's called the 10-year rolling average. So on any given 10-year look back, we can average no more than 4,800 acre-feet a year. Now we can use 6,756 because that's our consumptive use number by regulation. But on that 10-year average, we've agreed to 48,000 acre-feet on a 10-year rolling average. So that's a 30% reduction, shy under 30, I always round up. But so that's how we get to that, because that's a legal restriction on our water right usage that we went above and beyond. And there aren't people lining up to reduce their water rights by 30% voluntarily.
Thank you for that, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'm sitting here trying to do the math and keep up, and it's, so you basically bought 8,000 acre-feet that had been allocated. You get to use 4,800 after the conversion process, and you value those at $20,000 an acre-foot if that's delivered to your system and to be delivered to your residents, basically. So let's call that $100 million. Mm-hmm. And in your area, Hayes has 21,000. If you add Russell and Victoria, Walker, and you're around 30,000?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm coming up to about $3,300 per person to secure water for people for the future and for your growth. You currently have about 4,000 acre-feet, and this would add 4,800 acre feet and allow you to grow?
It will allow us to grow. This property represents a 75-year-plus option for the cities of Hayes and Russell. And so Russell has an 18% stake, and Russell will end up paying 18% of the project. Our project estimate right now is a little over $100 million. By the time we get to it, probably $120 million. 4 years ago, it was a $75 million project, so that's what project inflation's doing for us. So the intent is we have some money in the bank to help pay for this. In the late to mid 90s, the residents of Hayes voted for a half-cent sales tax. That's dedicated to water issues. We paid for our affluent water usage. We paid to redesign our Smoky Hill well field to make it more drought resilient. And mostly it gets put in the bank. And so we have money in the bank to help pay for this, and then we have a bonding capacity of the sales tax coming in to help pay for this. So if we didn't, it would be very tough for us to undertake this.
So you were basically in short supply. You want to grow. Water has a great deal of value to you. You're funding part of it with the sales tax. If the state legislature up here monkeys with your, let's say, food sales tax, that affects your funding for water.
Yeah, and that would actually hurt us even worse because in 2004, the residents of Hayes voted to implement a 3/4 cent sales tax that actually replaced their general fund levy. So I think we're still the only city in Kansas that does not levy a property tax for the general fund. We are supported solely off of franchise fees and sales taxes. So it'd be a big hit to us. I think conservative estimates about 1.4 million if the food sales tax were for us. And, you know, our fire department budget, I think, is around $2 million, just to put it in perspective.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Toby. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Next, we have Andrew Lyon with Kansas Department of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, good morning. My name is Andrew Lyon, and I serve as the Director of Conservation for the Kansas Department of Agriculture. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk with you a little bit about the mission, goals, programs, and partnerships of the Division of Conservation. Sure, and I believe I have a presentation there to pull up. Very good. Next slide, please. So again, the mission of the Division of Conservation is the conservation of all natural resources in Kansas. And that is a very broad mission. And so next slide, please. So we really have to then break that down into goals, right? And so we really look to protect our federal reservoirs, to reduce flood damage, to try and improve water quality, meet the water quality standards, and delist those water quality impairments. We're trying to improve the function of our wetlands across the state and our stream riparian areas. Again, trying to protect our soil resources, the long-term productivity of our soil. We're trying to improve wildlife habitat and protect wildlife, and we're trying to reduce the consumptive use of our groundwater. So next slide, please. So to do that, we implement programs. But the one thing I want you to really take away from my presentation today is that with all of our programs, we do not implement these programs alone. We implement them in partnership with a whole lot of different partners. One of our key partners is our conservation districts across the state. The Division of Conservation, again, is responsible for implementing the conservation district law. And so we have a conservation district in each of the 105 counties in Kansas. Now, I'm going to leave some of those details. Dan Meyerhoff is going to come up after me and talk more about conservation districts. I'll leave some things to them, but I will point out a few things. We also have a number of organized watershed districts throughout the state. These watershed districts are really look to reduce the impact of flooding, often by creating watershed dams. These dams hold back floodwaters and release them slowly after large rainfall events. We also work with a whole host of other state, federal, non-government, and increasingly private industry partners. We do have what we call our core conservation partnership here in the state of Kansas. And that group includes the USDA NRCS, the Kansas Association of Conservation Districts, the State Conservation Commission, which until 2014 was its own standalone state agency. In 2014, that was absolved into the Kansas Department of Agriculture. The State Conservation Commission continues as an advisory committee for the Division of Conservation. Of course, the DOC itself, and then the KACD Employees Organization. So making sure those employees have a voice in our partnership. Next slide, please. So, again, with all of those partnerships, to implement the different programs for the DOC, I want to step through those programs now. One that you'll see on our budget line item each year is our aid to conservation districts. Again, this provides matching funds to each conservation district in the state, up to $25,000 per year. So conservation districts receive funding from their county commissions each year, some well in excess of $25,000, but we hope that each county can get up to that $25,000 level, because when they do that, then we are able to match that. And that provides really the operating funds for those conservation districts. Just a couple of points. One is that county commissions last year actually put in about $3.3 million, because some counties put in well above the $25,000 level. The state's commitment there was only to $2.5 million. So our counties across the state are, in my opinion, doing their part to help support those conservation districts. The other point that I really want to stress here, and I know Dan will enforce when he gets up here, is that these conservation districts are co-located in almost every county with the USDA NRCS. And a key portion of that partnership is that through an operating agreement, the conservation district provides services to NRCS to help administer those federal programs. But for that partnership, we ensure that those federal resources are being used on these issues that are a state priority that we are trying to address. Again, currently, and we think into the future, the federal resources for conservation greatly exceed our state resources. In fact, there are some new opportunities available that will even increase those federal funds here in the near future. And again, we want to make sure that those federal funds are used in the best way possible to address the priorities of the state of Kansas. Again, each conservation district has 5 supervisors that govern the district, and those 525 supervisors across the state are unpaid volunteers, and they donate more than 50,000 hours per year towards conservation across Kansas. Next slide, please. So our flagship program across the state is our Water Resources Cost Share Program. Again, the primary goal of this program is to protect public water supplies. And really, we do that a whole host of different ways, because we know that our source water comes in various forms all across the state. And so this is where we really rely on each county to use their local knowledge and expertise to try and help us identify the practices that need to be in place to protect those water supplies. So again, the practices can take on a whole range of different practices based on the needs in that county. It's very valuable to have those conservation district supervisors with that local expertise to be able to help us understand what our best opportunities are to protect those water supplies. Next slide, please. We have a direct water quality program called our Non-Point Source Pollution Control Program. Again, water quality protection, trying to meet the water quality standards and delist those total maximum daily loads. We have really focused with this program on improving soil health to reduce sediment and nutrient runoff. And a key part of this funding is that we use it for a lot of education and information activities. So conservation districts across the state host local workshops, but we also support some of our larger events, the Soil Health U Conference, No Till on the Plains. There's a great one now that we're supporting called the Bottom Line Conference out in Kearney County. And so, again, our non-point source program is very valuable to us. Next slide, please. We do have 2 strictly water conservation programs. Our water tap program is in place to retire water rights to protect municipal water supplies. So currently this program is focused in in the Leota and Tribune area. It's in conjunction right now with a federal RCPP project that's going on. We're utilizing that state funding as match to leverage that federal funding. And we have been able to retire some groundwater wells, some irrigation wells that are within about a quarter mile of some of the city of Leota wells over the past couple of years. So we think that this program is a very good program when we can target it very closely to those public water supply wells. Our CREP program, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, is an addition or an enhancement to the federal CRP program. So in this case, we provide a state incentive payment to retire the water right if a producer will sign up for CRP and take that annual rental payment for the 15 years to put that farm ground back into natural vegetation. Again, we have seen both of these programs be very popular recently. It is, timing is a challenge for us with these programs. It does take producers longer to make the decision to enter into these programs. It is not a decision to be taken lightly. We are retiring water rights with these programs. It does take time, but when we are able to get those practices on the ground, this has been very useful programs. Next slide, please. A new program for us that started up in 2019 that we're very proud of so far is our irrigation technology program. Again, trying to reduce groundwater declines across the state by improving efficiency through increased technology. Some really neat technologies that are out there right now include soil moisture probes, mobile drip irrigation, bubbler nozzle packages, a new system that uses some ground penetrating radar that actually goes onto the pivot called autonomous pivot is something that we're seeing great interest in. And then maybe the most interesting thing is some of the telemetry options for remote control of those irrigation systems. Being able to turn on and off your pivot with your phone is pretty powerful technology and allows you to really manage that system for optimal efficiency. So again, very good program. We have partnered with all of the groundwater management districts when we implement this program. And in one case, GMD4, we've actually partnered where they have provided some cost share. We've put some money in and run a program jointly with GMD4, and it's gone quite well. A new program just in the past year, SFY23 was our first year for our soil health initiative. This soil health initiative, again, tries to be a force multiplier. We really try to support these demonstration projects and ways that we can be innovative in improving soil health. Again, we also use this funding to support the education, information activities that are across the state. And then we really have tried to use this funding also to help develop what are called ecosystem service markets, right? So you've probably heard of this in the form of carbon markets. This is a big part of what we see conservation trending towards in the future. These private ecosystem service markets have a lot of dollars backing them. Now, these companies that want to be involved have all done what they call supply shed studies, right? Trying to trace back their inputs for whichever products they make. And in the case of agricultural companies, almost without fail, that brings them back to the state of Kansas. It's not just that they want to work here, it's that since they source product here, they have to work here if they're going to reduce their supply chain emissions. And so we see great opportunity to continue to work with those companies. We need to make sure that we are taking the steps now to be ready to help producers understand these options and to have that infrastructure so that we can take advantage of these dollars when they're available. Next slide, please. Our riparian and wetland protection program really focuses, again, on those areas that are right near streams. We do a lot of forestry practices here. We do some small-scale stream bank stabilization. You'll see a picture there with a small-scale stream bank stabilization project. We're actually using eastern red cedar that we find on site, where we anchor those to the bank where we see erosion along the bank, and it'll actually slow down that water, catch some of that sediment. We'll see deposition over time, and we can stabilize that bank. We also work very hard on the restoration of our playa wetlands in central and western Kansas. We know those playas can be a source of enhanced recharge for the aquifer, and again, they provide excellent wildlife habitat. So a good program here, fairly small scale, but very targeted, and we work with a lot of partners with these programs. Next slide, please. So our large-scale stream bank stabilization program that we work in concert with the Kansas Water Office and the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. The goal of this program is to reduce sedimentation into our reservoirs. Again, this is focused on only 3 of our reservoirs above Tuttle Creek, above Perry, and then above John Redmond reservoirs. And again, those stream systems had a lot of erosion coming from the stream banks. And so we go in and really look for engineered solutions here. We slope the banks back, we armor those banks, and then we plant trees up on that bank so that we can buy ourselves some time, get that native trees established there so that that site will hold over time. Again, if you ever have the opportunity to go out and look at one of these stream bank sites, please do so. They are impressive projects. You know, it is a very costly program to implement, but we do believe we're holding back a tremendous amount of sediment from eroding and going downstream to our reservoirs with this program. So one of the practices that we know does great things for both water quality and to reduce sedimentation into our stream systems is to have stream buffers, native grass buffers. We've tried a few different things in the past with different buffer programs. And what we've really settled on at this point is the need to use the federal CRP program to try and get buffers put in place. There's really no way that farm ground that's down in those bottoms is usually pretty good ground. And producers often will not just voluntarily plant that to grass with no kind of longer term incentive payments. That's where CRP becomes a real option because they receive that annual rental payment. So what our sediment nutrient reduction initiative does is provide a state incentive payment on top of that federal rental payment each year. Again, we have some Tier 1 and Tier 2 targeted areas. And again, this program is targeted in some of these high priority watersheds above our federal reservoirs. And so, again, we know that these stream buffers are a great practice. Want to do everything we can to try and get more buffers on the landscape. I talked just briefly earlier about our watershed districts. Again, you don't hear as much about our watershed districts in my discussion today because they actually have local taxing authority. And so they have a local funding mechanism through their defined geographic scope. But we know that over time, the costs to build and now maintain those watershed dams are oftentimes in excess of what our watershed districts can fund through their local taxing mechanisms. So we do have a watershed dam construction program. I think back in 2006, we expanded that to include restoration activities as well. And we have a lot of work to do there, especially on the restoration side. Many of the watershed dams in Kansas, and there are about 1,500 of those dams in our organized watershed districts across the state, were built back in the 1970s and 1980s. We're now reaching the end of the lifespan of those structures, and many are in need of restoration. Again, when we don't have the dollars in place for restoration activities, it is a real risk. If those structures fail during large rainfall and runoff events, there will be damage downstream. It will impact structures. It will impact farm ground. And so the restoration of those dams is very important. We try to help our watershed districts stay as current as they can with the restoration of those dams. And finally, just a couple of programs that we still have on the books, but have not received funding in about the last 10 years is our water supply restoration program and our multipurpose small lakes program. Again, trying to help in cases where either municipalities or sometimes even regional water suppliers have restoration needs for these lakes, these reservoirs. We do know that there is interest in these programs, but quite frankly, the state water plan has just not been able to bear the cost of these programs in the past decade. But again, we know there is need in a number of places across the state for these programs. So just to touch on a few things about the DOC, we do run a pretty tight ship. Again, currently only 7 staff members. I report directly to Secretary Beam. Have 4 program managers. One of those spots is currently vacant. We had a retirement here just a few weeks ago, and then 3 support staff. So it's critical that we work with our partners to have that force multiplier effect to get conservation on the ground across the state. Just to touch on our budget very briefly, again, we generally see our budget each year in the $10 to $12 million range, primarily funding from the state water plan. We do have some federal grants that come in as well. And the reason I wanted to show this today was primarily just to state that these programs receive about half of the state water plan funding each year. So just to turn our eyes to the future a little bit, I do think there are some really great opportunities for us to continue to implement conservation on the landscape moving forward. Again, through the bipartisan infrastructure law, through the Inflation Reduction Act, there has been tremendous funding that will be made available for conservation here in the near future. We need to, again, make sure that that federal funding is used in ways that best support the priorities of the state of Kansas. And so that's really incumbent upon us to work with our partners to make sure that we are all in communication, that we understand each other's priorities so that we can utilize that funding to the best of our ability. There's also some really neat opportunities with some of the FEMA hazard mitigation funding. We're starting to open our eyes a little bit to the idea that not all of that funding needs to go to gray infrastructure, but to more green infrastructure projects, really working in watersheds to try and improve soil health, increase water infiltration into the soil so that we don't have so much runoff during especially flood events. And by doing so, we reduce the downstream hazards. And so that's really an avenue that we're following up on as well. I touched on it earlier, the idea of our private ecosystem service markets. Some of the latest figures I've seen are that in the next 10 years, just agricultural companies in the United States will seek to spend somewhere north of $14 billion on buying carbon credits, buying water credits, trying to reduce the carbon scores of their supply chains. And again, we need to take advantage of that. We need to build partnerships. Dan's going to touch on a few of the very first partnerships that we've built there. But again, we have companies contacting us routinely, wanting to find out how they can be more involved in Kansas. One of the things that we're really happy about that we've really seen a shift in the past, even just 5 years, is really focusing on return on investment with our conservation. I think, for a long time, we've really tried to tug at people's heartstrings to say that, conservation is a good thing and you should do it because it's good for the environment. That's difficult for a producer when they have to balance that with, their pocketbook and their, ability to make an income. We are now focusing more on practices that really focus on soil health and try to increase productivity, reduce overall input costs, and therefore make the producer ultimately more profitable. And so, again, that's kind of given us a new approach to conservation and one that I think will continue to bear fruit for us here in the future. And then finally, I would just add that, a great opportunity for us is to continue to build a capacity at the local level. So when the Natural Resources Conservation Service and the USDA started in 1935, they quickly realized that they couldn't, as a federal agency, get a lot done on the landscape. And so at that time, President Roosevelt actually wrote to every state and asked them to do 2 things. One was to create a state conservation agency, that would work with the federal agency. And the other was to pass a conservation district law and to create a local conservation district in every county across America. And that's exactly what was done in 1937. And so this partnership has lasted us now, for a good long while. And we think that will continue into the future. But again, we need to invest in our local partners. That really is the bottleneck in the system. That's where the rubber meets the road, where we actually talk to producers. I would like to get out and talk to farmers and ranchers much more than I'm able to, but it's the folks in those local offices that are talking with farmers and ranchers every day. We need to make sure that they have the support and the capacity to implement all of these programs that we've just talked about and be able to implement some of the new opportunities that we see coming in the future. And so with that, I would be happy to stand for any questions the committee might have today.
Andy, thank you very much. In the interest of saving a little bit of time for a report, if you have a question for Andy, I'm sure you'll be available here for a little bit after. Dan, do you want to make yours, if you could do yours in 15 or 20 minutes, I'd love to hear what happened across the Capitol building this morning.
I'll do my best to cut it down maybe 10 minutes. How's that sound?
Be great. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Dan Meyerhoff, and I am the Executive Director for the Kansas Association of Conservation Districts. And Andy already covered a lot of what maybe I have to say, and so I'm going to kind of cut through some of the slides and get to and maybe dig into some of the more details on the relationship we have with the DLC and that. But I do have a presentation, if you can find that. Okay, and just go ahead to the second slide. The mission statement of KACD and our member districts is providing local leadership to protect and improve Kansas natural resources through collaboration, education, and implementation at the local level. And next slide. Andy talked about, the close relationship we have with the Division of Conservation. The DOC, is responsible for administering conservation district law and provides oversight to conservation districts. And he talked about the different conservation programs, state programs that we deliver for the Division of Conservation. I do want to point out Kansas Reservoir Protection Initiative, which is a multi-agency initiative that conservation districts deliver, and also Kansas RAPS, the Watershed Restoration and Protection Strategy. That is a KDHE program. We have several conservation districts that are primary sponsors for the RAPS priority areas in their region. And then also KACD as an association, we have what we call a RAPS partnership agreement with KDHE, where we are the primary responsible entity for 20 of those RAPS priority areas, and we carry out a cost share incentive program through our conservation districts in those RAP priority areas, targeting specific targeted areas in those areas. Next slide, please. We'll talk a little bit about our relationship with USDA and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. NRCS provides financial and technical assistance across the state. They've got offices in 95 counties, and we assist NRCS with delivering those federal programs. EQIP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, ASEP, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and also CRP, which is a Farm Service Agency program, but NRCS provides that technical assistance. One of the benefits we have with this unique relationship we have with NRCS is access to technical assistance. We have ready availability to soil conservationists, agronomists, and biologists, engineers that provide technical assistance to our customers, not only for their federal programs, but for the state programs as well. The conservation districts also have over 40 technical positions that work side by side with NRCS to deliver these programs. Next slide, please. I do want to point out, NRCS has 95 offices in the state, but they work as 30 multi-county teams with one supervisor in those multi-county regions. Those are depicted in this map. Conservation districts work alongside NRCS within those management units. Yeah, we have a conservation district in every county and a conservation district board in every county. But, our technical staff work side by side with NRCS, across county boundaries within that management unit. And our district managers provide administrative services across county lines when there's heavy workloads, et cetera, along with information and education programs. Next slide, please. We also work with a lot of others. Our main partners are the Division of Conservation and NRCS, but we also work with other federal agencies, other state agencies. I've talked about Water Office, KDHE. We work closely with Extension on information, education, and other programs at the local level. The same with Wildlife and Parks and the Kansas Forest Service. We go on down through that list of organizations. We work with tribal governments. I participated in an education and outreach activity with the Potawatomi tribe on Tuesday, where we provided education event for the Boys and Girls Club there on the Potawatomi tribe. The non-governmental organizations, sorry about the acronyms, Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, Playa Lakes Joint Venture, Nature Conservancy, and others. We work closely with all of those, both on information education. A lot of those NGOs also have technical assistance and financial assistance that we can, make our customers aware of. Next slide, please. Andy talked about ecosystem services. In recent years, we've become to engage with private companies as well to increase the capacity that we have to, provide technical and financial assistance to our customers. 5 years ago, our National Association and KACD, we entered into an agreement with Land O'Lakes, their sustainability division called Truterra, to place positions in conservation district offices, 4 of them across the state, but working closely with the local ag retailer, their Land O'Lakes retailer, to provide information, education, technical assistance to their customers, and also educated their agronomists, their salespeople on the Farm Bill programs, the state programs that farmers could take advantage of. So, additional folks out there selling our programs for us. Land O'Lakes or the ag retailer paid for 20% of that position. A grant we received from our National Association paid for the other 80%. Kansas Climate Smart Initiative is an initiative that is a grant that we received from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Archer Daniel Midland, ADM, is a major contributor to that grant. We're hosting farmer-to-farmer education meetings on soil health across the state through that. We're going to be putting on 30 multi-county soil health events over the next 3 years. And a big part of that agreement is last year, ADM put over $1 million in cost share incentive payments to farmers in Kansas to apply cover crops. We're just finalizing our negotiations for the second year, and we're planning on expanding that to 200,000 acres of soil health practices that will be applied where ADM will provide the incentives. So a lot of private dollars out there, like Andy was talking about. The Eco Harvest Pilot Project. This one is with our National Association of Conservation Districts, the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, which is a nonprofit made up of about 70 private businesses, NGOs, and government organizations. And for this pilot, it's General Mills that is providing the funding that we're offering to our producers to apply, sustainable type practices. General Mills is providing a cost share incentive and actually buying carbon from those producers. And this last one is Northeast Kansas Soil Health Initiative, another National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant that we recently received. We're going to be placing a soil health specialist in the Jackson County office, Houghton, just north of Topeka here, working with farmers and ranchers over the next 10 to 15 counties, side by side with NRCS, to provide technical assistance, information education, and field days with the goal of over the next 3 to 5 years having a positive impact on 60,000 acres up in that region. Next slide, please. I've talked before about the strength that conservation districts have with youth and information education programs. We educate thousands of students across the state every year, both in single school events and multi-county events where we have up to 1,200 students involved. Next month, we're hosting an Envirothon, which is a high school competition. We'll have 4 regional competitions with normally about 60 teams participating, about 300 students, and a state competition with 10 to 15 teams involved. The winner of the state competition has the opportunity then to go on to the international competition, which is in Canada this year. You know, a great thing for 5 high school students to get to participate in. Next slide. Talked about adult education as well through that Kansas Climate Smart Initiative. We do a lot of adult information education, range health field days, you know, woody encroachment, soil health field days, et cetera. Conservation districts really excel at information education. And we don't do it alone. We do it with our partners, Extension, Forest Service, you know, Wildlife and Parks, and those NGOs as well. Next slide. Real quickly, local work group meetings. Back in the 1996 Farm Bill, conservation districts across the nation were given responsibility for hosting what they call a local work group meeting in every county or in local units. The purpose of these is to identify ag and natural resource concerns at the local level. That local work group then compiles that information, provides it to NRCS at the state level so that NRCS can tailor their programs, their federal programs, to meet those local needs. Last year and this year, KACD worked with the districts to facilitate those meetings on a management unit basis. So we held 30 meetings this year. If you go to the next slide. These were the top 6 concerns that came out of those 30 meetings. Of course, the drought. Mitigating the drought, how do we deal with, you know, drought on rangeland, cropland, et cetera. Water quantity, believe it or not, was one of the top priorities in the western part of the state. Water quality was considered a concern in every single 30 of the 30 local work group meetings. We talked about soil health, regenerative ag, cover crops. Those came up in a significant number of the meetings. Farmers wanting to transition to those types, you know, regenerative ag type practices, need information, need technical assistance. Increase in absentee landowners. You know, we have producers out there that are dealing with a lot more absentee landowners than we used to. You know, folks that inherited the land, there's 2, 3, 4 generations away from the farm now. For outside investors, how do we educate those folks on not just making money off that land, but being good stewards of the land as well? And so that was something that came up as one of the top concerns out there. And the last one was information and education on available programs. I've rattled off a lot of different things with federal programs, state programs, private companies being involved. You know, producers want to know, how do we learn about all these? How do we take advantage of these? And that's one of the things we're going to be working on as well. And with that, that's my 10-minute presentation, because I want to hear what they have to say.
And you did very well. Anybody has questions, you can bring them to Andy and Dan afterwards.
Absolutely.
I think Kansas is blessed to have people of this quality in these positions. You just got a wealth of information, very short time period, and I want to thank you guys. I'm catching a lot of heat from my right side. I'd like to ask for a report on what happened over in the Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No heat intended. Yeah, so the Senate hearing was very interesting. There was a big balloon amendment that was brought to House Bill 2279, and it generated a lot of discussion. And the senators weren't comfortable voting on the bill until they had more time to think about that amendment, so they tabled it until Monday.
2302.
They have not started working that bill. I think they're going to work it on Monday as well.
Stay tuned. That'd be great. Tony will get a copy of the amendment that was added to 2279. We'll share it with the committee members.
Mr. Chair, if I may, to confirm, it hasn't been added yet. I think a lot of the senators are trying to decide what parts of it they like and may not like, and so I think they're going to come back together on Monday and decide how to move forward with it. Thank you.
Representative Blacks.
Mr. Chair, I really like the innovative idea of City of Hayes with a dedicated sales tax for water. I like that.
They're following the Blex plan. Is there anything further for the committee? I'm not sure if Toby's still here. That's amazing what Hayes has done out there, and they're kind of a shining light as to what many places can do. Between conservation districts and the state, we've got a great partnership going there, and they both rely on local input. And to me, that's the critical thing concerning our water issues in many parts of the state. So thank you guys very much. If there's, I should probably tell you, we will try to work Senate Bill 205 next Tuesday. But first, we're going to have a presentation from David Pope, past engineer. So it should be a very good day. Hopefully, we won't have two events in this building going on at the same time. If the Senate is working on 2279 on Monday, you're sure welcome to go listen. If they're working 2302 on Tuesday, I may be missing. I'm sorry, but anything else for the committee? Seeing none, we are adjourned.